Welcome everyone. For people who don't know me, I'm Devanshi Purohit. I co-chair the BSA's Committee on Resilient Environments. We call it BSA Core with Dave here. And this is sort of our first event out of post-COVID era. And I'm really excited about it. For people who don't know about CORE, we are a group of people who've been really passionate about resiliency issues. And I know that BSA does a lot of events around it, so we try to focus our programming around three values or 3 pointers: ecology, community, and governance and policy. And try to also bring in more engineers and more people and experts from backgrounds that are other than architects. And that's what we've been trying to do with this group. We have 3 very different presentations here that Dave will introduce the speakers in a minute. But if you've not signed up for the emails and the updates, you can go to BSA's website or shoot us in a chat that you'd be interested in future events, and we can put you on the list. And I'll give it to Dave now.
Thanks, Devanshi. So yes, I'm Dave Hampton, one of the co-chairs of BSA Core. I'm a climate resilience associate at the Cadmus Group. And as Devanshi said, we pride ourselves in reaching across disciplines. So we're super happy today to have architects, planners, landscape architects, and people that kind of cross those disciplinary boundaries. So in order of presentation, we're going to have Arlen Stawas, who's having some connectivity difficulties. So we'll see if he joins us, with Tyler Hankley, followed by Despo Toma. Am I saying that right, Despo? Okay. And Dahlia Munninson. Arlen is a resiliency strategist and has focused his career on resilience planning for urban communities. He's done climate adaptation research in some of the most advanced water-focused societies. He's served as a former chair of ULI Boston's Climate Resilience Committee. Tyler Hinckley is an architect and a senior associate at Perkins & Will. And both Arlen and Tyler are adjunct faculty members of the BAC and have been co-teaching together since 2014. They've taught studios with a focus on Lynn, Chelsea, Everett, and Boston, as well as Atlantic City, New Jersey. They've won several research grants that have given them the opportunity to advance their resilience work. And last fall, they taught a studio in the Netherlands and will share their findings this evening. And I believe they've got some students that are joining us tonight, so that's awesome. Go next generation. That's exciting. Despo Toma is a senior designer at Scape. She is trained in architecture and urbanism, focusing on physical and social resilience, climate adaptation, urban storytelling, and engagement by design. Pardon the airplane in the background here. Currently, she's program manager for Climate Ready Dorchester in Boston and Greater Corktown Neighborhood Planning Framework in Detroit. Prior to joining Scape, Despo led the development of design strategies and engagement activities for the Water as Leverage program in Indonesia and the Islay Hyper Creek proposal for the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge in San Francisco. And then finally, Dahlia Munninson is an urban resilience specialist with a decade of professional experience in architecture and urbanism. She focuses on adaptation strategies and resiliency methods, and leverages experience in urban systems design, environmental planning, and architecture to work with local communities across scales towards resilient cities and urban environments. Dahlia is a Boston associate for One Architecture and Urbanism and leads the firm's work in the greater Boston area. She's an adjunct faculty at RISD in the Department of Interior Architecture, teaching adaptive reuse and resilience. And she got her master in architectural studies from MIT, the SMARCS Architecture and Urbanism program, and a bachelor in architecture and town planning from the Technion Israeli Institute of Technology. So we're very happy to have an exciting roster of folks. This is a rapid fire resilience event. So the idea was for a short presentation so we can have a nice dialogue afterward. Tyler, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Remind me, am I trying to stay to about 20 minutes?
More like 10.
10? Okay.
Or less, yeah.
All right, I'll go fast.
We can do about 15, so we still have time to have questions afterwards. And then I'll also ask everyone else to mute themselves at this point.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, all right? Can you guys see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
I'm going to go to full presentation mode. Is that better?
Better, yep.
Okay. So thank you for inviting us. Thank you to Arlen for connecting us here. And Arlen and I have been teaching together for a long time. So we're very adept at filling each other's roles and shoes and talking for each other. So hopefully this is as seamless as possible. As mentioned, we're going to be speaking about our studio from last fall, fall of 2019, where we partnered with the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam and developed a studio a parallel studio, and we visited the Netherlands. We had workshops, tours, and really worked together hand in hand to tackle the idea, the premise of the studio. This talk is really based upon our approach to resilient design. So I'll give you a little overview of that. We'll zoom in on the specific premise of the studio. I'll show some of the results of the work. We had 9 students. We split them into 3 groups of 3. So there are 3 projects. And then I'll just mention at the end the next steps, the next kind of iteration of this studio. So as you know, there are 2 billion people in this world without enough water. There are 2 billion people with too much water. And we as a society tackle these issues with the resources that we employ. Obviously, water is critical to life. Without it, there would be none. But we really control water. And the more we control it with our kind of man-made structures and devices, the more it controls us. And so we're really dependent, obviously, upon it. And that you couple that with the impacts of climate change, the disasters that we have faced in this country, for example, the costs are astronomical, right? Billions upon billions of dollars, from Katrina to Sandy to Harvey to Maria, and it just goes on. Point being that the United States has spent over $1 trillion revitalizing after those kinds of events. So it's really important to understand the scale. This is just a pitch to basically say, once we know all this information, we can't forget it. We have to do something about this. And that's our role as designers and planners. We mentioned that we've been teaching this studio now for quite a while, and it's evolved different sites, always with a focus on resilient solutions to these kinds of challenges. And in all cases, trying to partner with local communities to enrich the academic process. I'll highlight a couple key points here. Our ability to start to broaden our studio's reach and connect with other partners, particularly in Europe, with our research in Copenhagen, and then developing a partnership with the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam. They came to Boston in the fall of 2008, and we used the Climate Ready Boston plan, particularly in East Boston, as a starting point, and developed our studio around that. The idea was that the next year we would go there and they would host us and we would tackle an issue facing their location. So that's what led to this studio in the Netherlands. So the framing of that studio was this idea of, what if plan A doesn't work? So plan A, if you know the Netherlands, is building dikes and keeping the water out. All of the Netherlands is underground. They've done, or under sea level, and they've done an amazing job of making a country out of what you should be water and controlling that water. But and everyone just thinks they'll keep doing that. They'll keep building higher dikes and controlling the water. They've done it for so long, they know how to do it. But what if the scenarios are completely different? What if we should be thinking about a different plan? So a few years back, there were some research articles that came out that talked about, what if the projections are off? Or what if these projections really for sea level rise, go beyond our expectations, which is potential? What if Antarctica melts? What if all these things happen? We could be faced with 20 to 25 feet of sea level rise. So, in this case, we were in Europe, so it was 6 meters of sea level rise, which is such a huge scale shift that it's kind of unfathomable, but it's possible. And we used it as the framing of our studio. And it took inspiration from this article that then sparked a kind of an ideas competition. And there were a whole host of ideas proposed. This one that was developed by Lola really kind of got a lot of, sort of went viral and inspired the premise of the studio. So this rethinking of what the Netherlands could be as a water world of aquaculture and new kinds of cities and connection of cities. So there was, that was sort of the backdrop. So we challenged our students with that same question. And in fact, we asked them, should the people of the Netherlands stay there or should they go? And so our students had to develop an idea for each option. Should we stay or should we go? And that was kind of the subtitle of the studio. So we started off with developing these models of proposals for either figuring out how we could stay and live with the water or block it in some way and continue that trend, or maybe we should move to Germany, kind of rethink what that would mean. So our students took very different approaches within their teams to that. We also, as I mentioned, we went to the Netherlands, and it was an amazing opportunity to visit some of the kinds of projects that they've done there to address these issues over the years, and start to experience the shift in thinking. So, the previous kind of mindset is massive infrastructure, huge dams that block the water, to the new kinds of thinking where working with natural processes, letting currents move sand for you and create new kinds of barriers and water control systems that actually become amenities. Dunes, constructed dunes that have parking underneath them and create more opportunities for interaction with the water. So we were able to visit these sites and get a firsthand understanding of these kinds of solutions. Along the way, if you're a social media type, we documented our work via Instagram and Twitter. So if you want to check those out, there's a lot of some great images and process that our students put up for all to see. Just a few images of our trip there. So our students are here at the Academy for a little bit of unwinding after a big work session here in the courtyard. We visited the floating houses of Amsterdam to start to understand that as a typology, both kind of actual floating and more of these kind of houses that really engage with the water as new developments, new infill land areas. Different types of floating house developments, more of a controlled kind of development, whereas the first one was, a framework put in place and then allow for any kind of variation in between. So sort of a range of different approaches to housing. We were able to take a boat to this amazing landscape, completely newly created landscape that was trying to be more of a natural interpretation of a man-made place. It's more focused on creating habitat than for wildlife than for people. And so that was a pretty interesting experience. This is more of the sort of newer strategies that they're employing in the Netherlands. A couple of views of that. It was a really spectacular landscape. We also did visit some of their huge infrastructural wonders, the Maaslandsverkering storm surge barrier, which is basically like 2 Eiffel Towers side by, next sort of tipped over on their sides. Just a massive, massive piece of infrastructure that closes off basically the access to the port of Rotterdam in the case of a storm event. I mentioned some of the constructed dunes. This is a small sea town called Katwijk, and they decided instead of building just a bigger dike, they would actually build a bigger dune and put parking underneath it and create this wonderful habitat and place for paths and running paths and walking paths and protection to the water edge. Another one of those kind of wonders of engineering, the Oosterschelde-Carring storm surge barrier. Kind of a past solutions versus some of the more recent. This was a image of our trip to the sand motor. So this was what I mentioned before, where they're starting to let natural processes work with the designers and engineers. So dumping a bunch of sand in one place, letting the natural currents move it where it wants to go, and also create resources, amenities, a lot of windsurfing there. We visited smaller scale interventions where a dike was combined with a commercial street front. So on one side you have shop fronts, on the other side you have a park that creates a dike within the city of Rotterdam. We also were able to visit some of their strategies or their solutions to deal with increased precipitation. So a water park where sunken sports courts function also as detention areas for stormwater. This is just an image of our students pitching their ideas to the entire Academy audience, which, by the way, was a really amazing experience, and I recommend that for if any of you are teachers and thinking about how to get your students to synthesize their ideas into a very, very short presentation. So I'm going to quickly run through, how am I doing on time? Quickly run through some of the results. So this was one project of the studio where they basically created a new idea of how food and distribution would work within the Netherlands. So there was kind of a new barrier edge, but a mostly kind of an aquaculture within the country, but a preservation of some of the city centers. They then zoomed in and developed kind of a new idea of a marketplace as dike, as hub and intersection, as a project to test their idea. So you can see this marketplace as kind of an intersection between different types of industry and movement of goods, within the dike system that they were developing. Another group took a very different approach and basically said, we're pulling back from the coast. We're going to imagine a new kind of world where borders and boundaries are less defined, and that it was more about tying into a network across boundaries. So maybe there isn't a Netherlands anymore. There's more of an all-encompassing kind of humanity culture. They picked their site right on that boundary between where it used to be a river. It on one side is what used to be the Netherlands and is now the ocean, and on the other side is terra firma, and looked at that as an opportunity to understand that new transition. And they developed it as an educational space, an educational intersection. Third student group focused on also intersection. I think probably all of our students did that, now that I think of it. So they maybe were a little bit more along the lines of the first group, where they protected certain areas or reinforced certain areas, but let others go back to water. And they were very much looking to capitalize on that natural and environmental resource and develop along that new resource and think of ways of developing along that. And so they actually were thinking about these kind of new zones in between what we think of as the kind of typical hubs of the Netherlands, like Rotterdam and Utrecht and Amsterdam, that there'd be a densification of the spaces in between with the way that they were developing their vision plan. And they focused on a transportation hub that would allow for this interconnectivity around what was sort of left of the Netherlands, and thinking about it across the modes of transportation: train, boat, bike. So they were using this as a way to tie it into that natural resource that was a creation of kind of letting the water take much of the country. So that was the work that we had from last year, and this year we have come back to Boston and are focusing on this same kind of challenge. That what if Boston had to face this challenge? So here's just a little teaser. You can see the old map of Boston underneath with a new coastline if nothing's done and there's 20 feet of sea level rise. It's pretty striking to see that it basically goes back to what was before all of the infill that we are all so familiar with today. So it's a pretty provocative idea. We actually proposed this as an idea to the BSA for the water exhibition that was slated for next year. And our students are pondering this right now and presenting next Monday their big idea for what to do about this. I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Tyler.
Thank you. So next we have Despo. While she brings up the presentation, feel free to use the chat window if you have questions, and then we can collect those questions and have a larger discussion after the remaining two presentations.
All right, so I am sharing my screen and I am trying to go full screen. Let's see. All right, did that work?
Looks
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, great, awesome. All right. All right, so thanks Dave, Devansh, for the invitation and for the introduction. And it's great to be among so many lovely people and discuss very critical issues. So I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about SCAPE and our resiliency work in Boston, especially in the last couple of years around the Climate Ready Dorchester initiative and the Resilient Boston Harbor vision prior to that. So for those who don't know, SCAPE is really a group of landscape architects, urban designers, planners, horticulturalists, and many more that form a very diverse and interactive group of thinkers and designers. We have two physical locations, many remote ones. We have one physical location in New York City, one in New Orleans. And our work focuses a lot on plazas, streetscapes, waterfront design, large-scale parks, canals and creeks, ecological planning, urban resiliency, which is something we'll focus tonight, and other things include roof gardens, with a lot of emphasis in across all of our work on community engagement, civic spaces, and schools. Very quickly, some of the things that you will find in a lot of our projects is that we try to revive landscape systems. We try to forge connections, invisible and visible ones, between the different species and the different habitats of our environment. We try to generate thriving ecosystems. And we really want to embrace the physicality and the physical reality of our environment and our proposals. We want to engage people where they are, be tactile, be pragmatic, and really get back in touch with our habitat and our environment. And we really want to experiment through our design and through our processes. We want to intentionally design projects that gather more knowledge for us to move forward into the future. So the aim is to always be designing the next way to gather knowledge through experimentation. Specifically in Boston, our work, we really dove on, and we really had the opportunity to dive into resiliency in Boston with the Resilient Boston Harbor Vision in 2018, where we had the opportunity to work with the mayor's office and many departments from the city to identify what would a resilient Boston Harbor look like in the long-term future. We were able to dive into the specifics of transit planning, waterfront planning, where do open space investments might happen, where does the real estate market want to take the waterfront, and really take all of those parameters and put our hats on as integrators and try and re-envision how a resilient waterfront can look like, with an emphasis not only in just reducing coastal flood risk, but also in increasing accessibility, with an emphasis in mobility, with an emphasis in ecological restoration and enhancement where possible, and with an eye towards equity and inclusion in the spaces that we design. So we're very excited last year when we had the opportunity to continue this work through the Climate Ready Dorchester initiative. I'm sure all of you or many of you are very familiar with the Climate Ready Boston projects. It's a series of neighborhood plans at this point, where the goal is to identify near-term and long-term solutions for coastal flood risk reduction in the various neighborhoods. And we had the great opportunity to work in the neighborhood of Dorchester. So what you see here in the image is sort of the bounds of our site. It stretches all the way from John Mockley Park all the way to the Neponset River Dam. So it's a very long 9.5 miles of coastline, diverse, and really a condition that you cannot study as one piece. You have to sort of look into the specifics of every different area. As you see here, some of the characteristics of the areas where the Southeast Expressway is running, the red line, some of the key, let's say, places, Tinian Beach, the Neponset River, Malibu Beach, and you see at the forefront here, UMass Boston, and the JFK UMass Station. What is really exciting about Dorchester is that if you look at the historic maps, for example, this 1870 historic map to the right, you see that it's an area filled with creeks, salt marshes, intertidal systems, a very lush environment that expands from the Neponset estuary that you see at the bottom of the page here. And as you can all imagine, and Tyler, to what you just said, that nature takes back, or flooding takes back what nature used to look like. And you will see that the flooding extents really try and mimic the same outlines that we see here for the historic marshes. Dorchester is also the largest and most diverse neighborhood of Boston. And as you see to the right here, it's a racial dot map. So this is a very interesting map to look at because we do say it's the most diverse neighborhood in its entirety, but if you look closer, you would see that the waterfront has no dots, or it has only dots in two waterfront communities that I will highlight here, Harbor Point and Port Norfolk, but the majority of the waterfront remains white because it's mostly occupied by infrastructure. And then you see that there's a concentration of Asian, especially Vietnamese populations along the Dorchester Avenue, and then a segregation of Black and Latino towards the inland and whites towards the waterfront. Why do I bring this up? Because when we're trying to understand how do people interact with the waterfront, then this comes into play. Who has access to the waterfront? How accessible is the waterfront? Is Dorchester a waterfront community, or is it just that some people identify themselves as residents of a waterfront community? Another important point to bring up is that most of the coastline is owned by the state. So the jurisdiction is very interesting here because it's public land, but it's not owned by the city of Boston. So how do we design for solutions that can increase collaboration between city and state to provide resiliency for the neighborhood? So how flooding happens in Dorchester is a very interesting question because it happens in two main ways. Fringe flooding, which is a more typical way of flooding where the water comes up the topography, and flood pathways where the water finds low points along the coastline and enters and floods areas in the back that are not directly facing the water. So this is very interesting because as you see, they're very concentrated points, these pink points along the coast. So if we're to look at the waterfront today, we can see the remnants of the old salt marshes that express themselves as today open spaces and beaches. Tinian Beach, Victory Park, Malibu Beach. Further up the Neponset, we see the Neponset River Reservation, Pope John Paul II Park, etc., with very limited points of access. And then we see that when we overlay the flood risk, we see that those very isolated points of access are at the same time the inundation points. So it becomes really important, and it became apparent from the start of the project that investing and connecting those points, it would be of great importance for the resilience of the neighborhood, because those are the only points that the community can connect with the water, but it's also the points where the water enters and floods the neighborhood. In addition, thinking about the Boston Harbor Walk, thinking connectivity along the water, it becomes really important to try and create a more accessible waterfront, both inland to the water, but also north to south. And this really builds upon the ideas that came out of the Resilient Boston Harbor Vision 2018, where the design team and the city were able to put forward a more aspirational vision on how we can thicken this coastline and make it more resilient. Through our engagement process, we had the opportunity to look closely at those flood pathway points. You'll see here in the images with a variety of tools, we were able to both communicate how does the water enter under these underpasses from the highways, and how does it manifest itself. So you see people here holding, back in the time that we could actually meet in person, holding iPads and being able to see in a 360 way how the water comes in through those underpasses, and experience it so they can understand how critical those points are. In addition, we wanted to understand how do people perceive the waterfront. So with this physical model, we were able to understand how do people feel when they approach the waterfront, which areas are a positive experience for them and which areas are sort of not so positive. We're able to analyze those results, and it's really clear that people had very satisfactory experiences along the waterfront where they're able to continuously walk along the waterfront. So for example, along the Neponset, or in those isolated points along the waterfront where amenities exist. And that the identified areas where experiences need improvement, let's say, mainly along those big infrastructural areas where the highways and the rail and the road system intersect. Based on this feedback, we were able to develop what we call the coastal resilience vocabulary with a variety of tools to serve different purposes. Those tools can either adapt elements to sea level rise, so adapt infrastructure, adapt buildings to sea level rise. They can protect against storm surge, or they can minimize wave action and prevent erosion where that is needed, or in very strategic locations, think about retreat or strategic acquisition when that is the best option. With that in mind, and with a closer look at analyzing the risk profile of each of the neighborhood, we're able to narrow down the solutions to a couple of options per different zones. So responding to the character of the risk, but also the site-specific constraints of each zone. So with that, we went back and we had another gathering with residents and constituents of the neighborhood, where we verified the goals and aspirations that were set forth from the first workshop, that we're actually, yes, indeed, trying to develop both near-term and long-term solutions to equitably reduce coastal flood risk. We want to enhance access and mobility. We want to promote the health of valuable ecosystems such as the Neponset. And we want to define or enhance the identity of the Dorchester waterfront, that it seems that is many waterfronts next to each other. With a variety of different tools and methods, we try to communicate what the different options for different areas are. And we try to engage in conversations on what are the trade-offs or what are the different benefits we get out of each. And based on this input, we were able to go back and refine those solutions. So for example, you see on the screen here, two options for Morrissey Boulevard, which is a main infrastructural piece that is currently at risk today, is flooding often, as you all know. What are different solutions and how we can enhance the resilience of the roadway itself, but also how do we provide protection for areas behind the roadway when that is needed? So based on that feedback and going through an extensive flood modeling analysis, we were able to identify what solutions work and what solutions might not work, and narrow down the preferred ones for the final recommendations of the report. And because this is a teaser, I will leave you with a tease. Let's say that the report is coming out in the next weeks, I want to say. It's being finalized as we speak, and we're very excited for you all to see the final recommendations. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And hope that we'll be able to do a follow-up session once the report is out.
It is a teaser indeed.
Dalia is our next presenter. Dalia, you're on mute.
Okay, so, but I assume you can see my screen though.
Yes.
Cool, thank you. So I think thanks to Devanshi and Dave for inviting me and for organizing this nice event. I will talk about an ongoing project in the Island End River in Chelsea and Everett, specifically focusing on work we've done last year based on a grant from CCM. It's kind of similar to what Devanshi mentioned. This is more, I think, planning and coordination focused, as the design itself precedes what we looked into last year was mainly how to build resilience between two communities with multiple challenges when it comes to implementation and when it comes to kind of developing solutions that will be coordinated with private stakeholders in an environmental justice community, but also in an industrial area that's extremely significant to the larger Metro Boston area. So if you can see here, this is downtown Boston, and this is East Boston and the Tobin Bridge. This is the Island End River, and it's kind of divides between Chelsea and the Admiral Hill and Everett with a large designated port area right on the banks of the Mystic River on one side and on the eastern side on Chelsea Creek. And essentially what we started looking into was also another step in the work Chelsea has been doing to evaluate and assess their own flood vulnerabilities, but also developing solutions. And once they started looking at the Island End River that used to be kind of this meandering path inland with a large area of marshland that was reclaimed similarly to what DESPA showed in the rest of Boston, they realized that it's something that has to be done together with Everett because you can't solve only one side of the problem without having the water enter and impact the larger area that is shared by the communities. So one small shout out to Devanshi. And I thought Arlen and Tyler were going to talk about it, but last year we also did ULI Living with Heat, and our team with Devanshi and several others focused on the area of Chelsea and Everett. That's at the same time, as you saw in the previous image, is heavily paved with not too many pervious surfaces. It's also heavily industrialized with a lot of freight coming in and out, and therefore a lot of increase in urban heat. So one of the exercises we've done, and this is an image that made mainly by Devanshi, was essentially looking at the area and how it can develop with a greener impact on the areas that are cooler, and essentially connect to the Island End Park with greater community amenities and public amenities. So it will also have impact not only on flooding, but also on this network of cooling areas. So jumping back to the flooding story, this is the Island End River, and it used to be this meandering river with many marshlands that with time were filled out as land was reclaimed into this heavily industrialized area, starting with marine and shipping industries, and to later on to have the essentially one of the kind of oil and tar sand factories. And today there's power plant, the New England Produce Center, and all sitting on heavily polluted soils. Some of them were capped in the recent decades, so however, some of them just been there, kind of being reused for different industrial uses. Today, this area is used by the New England Produce Center. Essentially, most of the fresh fruit and vegetables in the Boston area comes from here. So is the flower market and many other kind of logistical and distribution facilities that receive things from the airport or from the port are located here. They relocated from the New Market area and from Boston once that area started kind of gentrifying or developing as a more residential area. And now at the same time, this is extremely important to kind of maintain this in the specific location because it's relatively close to the center. It's vulnerable to potential flooding already. At the same time, it might be vulnerable to market and development pressures. So one of the things we started looking at, and this is a kind of a bureaucratic anecdote, was that once we started looking at the FEMA maps that were from 2010 showed that essentially the floodplain stopped at the boundary of Chelsea and Everett and never extended into Everett. Although if you would look at the topography or if you would look at the historic outline of the river, you would assume that the floodplain would extend to all of this area. And what happened at the time was that after Hurricane Sandy, many FEMA maps of coastal counties were updated and developed. And while Chelsea is in a coastal county, Everett is in a different county. So it's a Middlesex and Suffolk. And Everett didn't have their flood maps updated. So while this area was in the floodplain, this area, although it might flood, was out of the floodplain. Hopefully the new maps will be released this year, by the end of this year, and then they will align at the same kind of level of logically correct flood maps. So one of the efforts the City of Chelsea have done previously in 2017 was to start looking at their flood maps and evaluating important locations for improvements, for implementation of solutions, and for strategies, similarly to the Climate Ready Boston work. And they proposed, they identified several sites with great importance to address and approach. And one of the sites was the Island End River. And their solution, and it's kind of small here, was essentially to improve the park and build a berm or a flood barrier at this edge. So if this is the Island End River and this is the current park, the idea was to have a berm at this edge. However, once we started looking into the maps with our grant last year, was essentially mapping Everett that didn't have updated flood maps, and we couldn't find them based on FEMA maps. And we started seeing that essentially, although if this is the boundary between the two municipalities, if we only address this side, we will see flood pathways and flooding coming in from around this area and impacting both communities and, more importantly, the New England Produce Center. And so by 2030, with the increase of 9 inches in sea level rise, we would essentially see a large area of almost, I think, 600 acres between Chelsea and Everett, including the Silver Line stop, the Market Basket, and the area that I showed at the beginning of the ULI sketch that is also supposed to be a new development area for the city, is all prone for flooding by 2030. And then by 2070, we get flooding from kind of upper on the Mystic once water will overtop the Amelia Earhart Dam. So looking at approaches towards kind of resiliency and how high we need to go, we essentially look at around, if we're looking at 9 feet, we will need to get to 15 to 14 feet in order to address the probability of a 500-year storm by the year 2070 with 36 inches sea level rise. And just kind of to summarize, all of the different areas and kind of the extent of industry that will be impacted, but also properties that will be impacted. Potentially by 2070, we will look at almost 600 lots and over 800 acres in total. So our approach for this was relatively straightforward. We would look at compartments. So we have this idea of the Island and River Park that will address this area. It's also owned by the city. So it's kind of relatively simple solution. Simple. Extremely complex, but doesn't have additional complexities. And then in order to close this compartment and area that will be impacted by this flood pathway, we will need to find a way to reach higher ground somewhere around here, which is essentially kind of beyond the historical marshland. This area is already in Everett. And then develop a second compartment that will go along the coast of the Mystic. And it's a bit more complicated because this is a designated port area. So many of the facilities here use the waterfront daily with shipping and materials. So they need this area accessible. So it will be more complicated. However, this potentially is the first compartment that will address the near-term flooding. And so this is the kind of a sketch of how we could address the Island and River. And it's work done with Weston and Sampson and Adria, who's also here. So potentially having the barrier at the edge of the park, at the edge of the kind of city-owned property, and then grading and adding various decks and boardwalks that will enhance the experience. And this is the phase we're actually in now. The City of Chelsea received an MVP action grant, and we're working with Weston and Sampson on kind of finalizing the design of how this will impact the park and all of the documents that will implement this section. So in order to create this tieback that will go to higher elevation, we will need to encounter various interesting properties, and these are part of the complications here. So most of the area in Everett is privately owned. Throughout the years, it was sold to different industrial properties, and essentially the city has very little information about even anything that's going underground when it comes to utilities. The only thing that the city owns is this section of the street. And then other areas that are at the coast, which we might encounter if we would like to propose something along the coast, are areas that were capped with the NOAA grant, specifically in order to cap some of the oil, tar, and sand factory, and will be very difficult to adjust or remove in case we would like to elevate this to higher elevation. And then as we go inland, we might encounter more complexities that are either the private properties that we would like to coordinate with. So if potentially we will imagine we need to have 6-foot wall here as a flood barrier, many of these logistic facilities will need access, and therefore they will need gates. And gates will impact our ability to rely on this system. And then the last the last element that will complicate the system is also the need to cross rail. And this rail is essentially used by many of these industrial properties to move things along the designated port area. So we outlined for Everett this kind of large array of possibilities, each with their extreme complexities, while recommending that potentially the one that will go on the public property will be the preferable. The preferable from the perspective that will be easiest from the regulatory perspective. And then while the one that can go along the coastline will be the one potentially best to create more public benefit and access to the waterfront for the community of Everett and Chelsea. And the evaluation criteria of each and every one of these options is also similar to the process that we had in Climate Ready East Boston and downtown, and it's systematic across the district plans, essentially looking at various elements according to which we can evaluate each and every one of these options. So whether it's the area of protection and the level of protection, the failure risk, so potentially if we have a gate, it might increase the failure risk of a system at an event of a flood, the cost of each and every one of them, and operation and maintenance that becomes more complicated once we look at private properties and we require private and public partnerships. And all of these options were reviewed while specific recommendations were given to Everett. And today we're working with Weston & Sampson, Chelsea, and Green Roots and the Mystic River Watershed Association on the first chunk that is in Chelsea, and it's the Island End Park. So just to finalize this, right now we're looking at the design of the park, and one of the first public events that we're planning to have, and this new COVID reality, will be a coastal cleanup next weekend. So if anyone would like to join, we will also be sending a survey as part of our community engagement to hear how many people are using the park. So what's essentially important when we look at this space is to find a way to reconnect the community from Chelsea to the waterfront and to provide them use. And Chelsea has a little bit more access to the water. I think Everett has almost none areas where they can access publicly to the waterfront. And at the same time, see how we can create this new habitat and improve the wetlands and the park while it's still in this very industrialized area. So this is kind of our focus now. That's it. So, should I stop? What should I do?
Great, thank you so much.
It was a great informative session. I want to thank all the presenters. I think Arlen made it finally. But I also want to open it up for discussion with the group. If people have questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
And if you're shy,
I could jump in.
Prompt it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think I also didn't know quite what Dahlia was going to be presenting, so we should talk more. But what's interesting is Arlen and I had a studio uh, before East Boston, we focused on that exact site of the food distribution center, and looked at, what would happen. And we focused mostly on the food distribution, but the solution for that critical junction at the end of where it goes into the culvert of the Island End River was, right the center of the focus. So it's very interesting to see, how that has progressed since then. That was probably what, I don't know, 3-4 years ago now. So yeah, interesting.
I was going to jump in and say one observation I had was that Tyler, you mentioned, I think you made a good case that the Dutch are long known for being comfortable being on the water, around the water, having it around them. And I wondered if that speaks to them being a step ahead in terms of adapting to other climate challenges. Dahlia touched on the ULI living with heat. So, this is a very wet kind of endeavor this session, but heat is part of it. And it struck me when you were showing, Dahlia, the aerial of Chelsea and Everett, that it was so many impervious surfaces. So I wondered what, is bringing people closer to the water or bringing the water closer to the people, does it also bridge to other risks? Any thoughts on that, like heat or pandemics or?
So maybe I'll start. So the short answer is, I'm sure there is. Providing open space and access to green space is eventually helpful to urban heat. I think probably urban heat needs to be addressed in the areas where it is happening. So then potentially you can come to the park to enjoy it and cool off. But it will have greater impact if you're addressing it close to where you are, close to residential areas and close to the urban environments. I think one of the things that we saw while working on the heat project with the ULI was essentially that in these areas that are heavily industrialized, the roads are relatively narrow and there's not enough space to accommodate many other, whether it's modes of transit, but also many plantings. And I think an additional challenge when it comes to this area especially is the condition of the soil. And the fact that it's even uncertain if anything will survive there. So I think there is a lot of challenges when it comes to these projects to try and incorporate many things.
Well, to piggyback on that, Dahlia, sort of getting back to Dave's introduction to that question about, well, maybe they're sort of better prepared to address these kinds of things in the Netherlands as a mindset. I think the points of your presentation, Dahlia, where you talk about all the impediments to instituting these solutions, the bureaucracy of how Everett's flood maps don't even match Chelsea's and they share a border. To me, that's one of the fundamental differences, the way that we as a country operate, as opposed to the Netherlands, where the government controls it all and they can make sweeping moves that have huge scale. The current example is the probably more sensitive strategy of making room for the water in the sort of inland portion of their country, but they call it the Making Room for the River project. But they're displacing people from their homes to make spillways and ways for water to pool when it has flooding. That's something that would be very different here. Obviously, we have a history of taking over places, but it's a lot harder to do now, I think. That's not to say that what they do there in the Netherlands is necessarily better. I think that when we were visiting there as visitors, my takeaway was that they are very much still controlling their environment there, and it's the environment there. It's kind of consistent across so much of an area, whereas in this country there's so many different types of conditions, from the coast, the East Coast, to the middle of our country, to the West Coast, and there's so many different variations.
Yes. So any thoughts?
I got a question for Dahlia.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, sorry. Hey, Dahlia, I've been screenshotting these presentations, so I may have misunderstood, but were you essentially damming off that, what's acting as a water sink right now when it floods? Are you damming it off? You're preventing the water from...
Well, in a way, if you're building a flood barrier at the edge of that reclaimed land, so technically it is some sort of a dam, I would assume so. But there is a culvert, so the Market Street, essentially the river was culverted once the area around it was reclaimed, and the culvert is in very bad condition. It's actually deteriorating and kind of collapsing along its path. So in some areas, and it's also kind of meandering between Everett and Chelsea. So in some areas, the cities are looking at daylighting portions of it and replacing the culvert itself. So whichever solution there will be that will include this flood barrier, it will also include new gates and that connect directly to the culvert.
Oh, and so will that, so the reason I asked is I was wondering if you needed to look at the downstream impact of barricading what used to be a release for floodwater out of the river. And maybe the culvert does that. Maybe reconstructing new culverts would do that. Or is there an impact downstream?
So downstream, it's just, I can share a photo. Downstream, it's just connects to the Mystic. Wait, where? I have a good photo. Maybe this, like, oh, sure.
I'm thinking of when they used to construct jetties and barriers along beaches, then beaches downstream suddenly had a different, negatively impacted, other communities downstream.
So this is essentially the Mystic River, and right now the land ends here. Yeah. So this is the portion of the river that still exists.
Right, right.
So in the 40s, the river still went this deep, all the way to the rail line.
Yeah.
And even now, this is filled. So this is where the culvert stops. I think I might have one photo of the culvert.
You do.
This is the culvert now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think the cities are planning to apply for a FEMA grant for the construction of this culvert.
I guess I'm just wondering if you're going to cut off essentially what is a retention pond back there, even though it's not supposed to be, whether I don't really know this business that you guys are in, but whether you're able to reproduce that in a location that's safer, that will sort of take on that water and then release it slowly or in some way that doesn't impact other river abutters downstream. Does that make sense?
Yes and no. So one thing that if we do build this barrier, so essentially we will need to pump any water that will be collected on this side, and then throw it back into the river. I think when it comes to impacting other abutters along the river, I think this still belongs technically to the ocean. I don't know if I have Okay, zoom out image. So this is the entrance to the island and river. So this is still the ocean. And when it comes to flooding and creating compartments and impacts that are related to basically to the ocean and not the river, it doesn't really impact the volume of flooding on other areas because it's still part of a larger volume.
It becomes insignificant, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So if it was like upper on domestic behind the Amelia Earhart Dam, then it will have an impact potentially.
Okay. But today, like this map is old. So when I look at this map, I say, oh yeah, that's almost part of the ocean. But if I look at a current map, that Mystic River area is really is so much more choked off. So that's an old map too. But if you looked at a current map, it's almost as though the Amelia Earhart, I think that's what you called it, has sort of moved upstream, you know, as far as the narrowness of the river and all that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, so my question is that really part of the ocean at that point?
Yeah, if it's helpful, I'll bring up an example.
Wait, I'll stop my video.
No, that's good to look at actually. The Climate Ready Dorchester plan, we actually intentionally modeled the solutions. We run the flood model after we developed the solutions to see actually what would be the impact on the other side of the Neponset River in Quincy, for example. So it's not an open harbor anymore at that condition. It's more of an estuary.
Right.
So we wanted to make sure that any proposals that we put in place are not going to impact Quincy. And actually the results came back and showed almost zero. Actually, I don't see it with my eyes impact. So
good that you tested it.
It would have to be a very granular study to see a very minimal, if there is change. So that gives us a sense of the impact in other areas like island and river. I would imagine.
Yeah, precedent. Okay, thanks.
I think we're about that time.
Yeah. Any other burning questions? We can keep going. We can prompt. I had one other thought, building on these comments. Jeffrey's comment is an interesting one because it talks to how much the hydrology has changed on the coast and in general. So it's not just the coast, because then you're talking about inland hydrology as well. So Tyler, you talked about how it's kind of command and control, sweeping government control in the Netherlands, whereas in the US it's more piecemeal. I find it interesting that in Boston and in most North American cities, we built out into the water. We claimed land, reclaimed land, however you want to say that, and then at some point we stopped. And what we're left with is a real jigsaw puzzle of coastal conditions, coastal riverine, estuarine conditions. So this is mostly a comment, not really a question, but I think it's striking that we're kind of painfully redrawing those coastal lines again. And there's so many issues. You know, there's historic seawalls that no longer function as seawalls. There's, if folks know the Fort Point Channel, I've always found it to be a totally dead body of water. It used to be a creek. It used to be a living thing. Now it's just occasionally they have a piece of art floating in the middle of it. But other than that, it's, you know, I feel like the projects that we've seen today are really taking the opportunities to kind of redraw that coast, which is, there's a little bit of hubris there, but if we don't think about it, what's the alternative? So I commend all 3-4 of you presenters for getting to work on things and present some things that really kind of take the initiative and use design as a tool to help people understand the potential to change these conditions, hopefully for the better.
Dave,
just a comment.
Hey, Dave, in the residential development world, it used to be that people were almost, their insurance, when they would put these homes at really at-risk areas, and they were kind of subsidized somehow through federal insurance. I don't really, I mean, I know that was true, and it encouraged people to really build out the areas they shouldn't have. I don't know if that's also the case for industrial areas that that Dahlia is studying. You know, like illogical incentives.
Great question. Great point.
Yeah.
Talia, do you know specifically? I know that that's definitely a growing concern in the residential insurance market. Is sure, build where you want as long as you pay for it, and the insurance is getting more expensive. So that's those incentives or disincentives are growing, which is ultimately a good thing if it makes people think twice. Talia, I don't know if you had specific instances of
Yeah, I think
industrial property.
it's an interesting condition specifically there because many of the industries that are located in the designated port area in Everett have nowhere else to go. So I don't know much about specific insurance because FEMA usually relates to residential premiums, but since they weren't mapped as flood-prone areas, they weren't very concerned about that. And while the roads around them flood frequently, trucks are still high enough that they can go through. But when it comes to the specific properties, so for example, there's the power station, and it's the backup for most of the greater Boston area. And they have been trying to sell this property for many years. And this, I think they have to stay because they have some agreement with the state to remain in the location and provide their services. And at the same time, there is also pressures from the casino, from the casino that was built, and many of the housing in the area is being kind of priced out or being bought by the casino developers and others. So there are pressures from many sources and from many directions. However, they still maintain in the same location. From one perspective, because it's important to have this employment center and provide the services that they provide, but also they can only go kind of outside of the metro area and then Worcester or somewhere further, because there wouldn't be any other location when they can remain in.
You know, Dave, you make me think about this, how you're talking about, you know, we used to make land or take land and we stopped doing that, but now we're rethinking how we do that along the coastal edge. I don't think I actually did a very good job explaining this as part of the studio. Not only were we asking our students to think about a huge amount of sea level rise, but we were also thinking about it a long time in the future. So 200 years in the future. So this studio, for example, right, this semester is Boston in 2220 with 20 feet of sea level rise. And what we've found with that as part of the exercise is that it means you no longer have to think about sort of the real world solving issues of today or tomorrow or even 50 years from now, that it's so many generations away that you can kind of leave away some of the baggage. And it's an interesting design exercise for that fact. So, you know, it's something to consider as we obviously solve what for the issues that are in front of us. But I wonder, as we think about these solutions for Dorchester, for East Boston, that, you know, how do they project forward 200 years? And when you start to do that, you also have to remember, you know, 200 years ago, we didn't have planes, we didn't have we didn't have, so many things were different, right? There were so many fewer people. There was a completely different way of life. So it's just, it's an interesting thing to think about as we think about our designs now, as they, you know, change and how they translate forward.
I think yes. To build on that, I agree, Tyler, because if we're assuming that the city will be the same 70 years from now and 80 years from now, then I think we're not grounded in history or in reality. Looking 80 years back, the city was much different. And the other thing I think that sort of goes hand in hand with that is how are we valuing these projects and the decisions that we're making for our cities now. And I think Dorchester was an example where if you take the typical number crunching methods where you take the value of real estate along the coastline and you contrast that against the risk, let's say, of that value being lost, then residential areas like Dorchester or areas that are heavily, there's a lot of industry, there's a lot of transit infrastructure, they don't pencil out in the same way that, for example, downtown would pencil out as something worth protecting exactly where it is as it is. So it was really exciting to be able to have conversations with stakeholders in the community during the Climate Ready Dorchester process that were not by default about protecting what it is the way it is today, but they were open to thinking about adaptation, about strategic acquisition of perhaps parcels that are not residential, not high value, but they could offer a benefit as an area of investment in protection or in adaptation. So we started having those kind of conversations during this process, and it was really invigorating because I think the city will have to start thinking in that way for the long term.
You're talking about strategic. Michelle had put a comment in the chat that she thought she had noticed that you either mentioned at the same time or at two different slides that the flood pathways were also where people like to go.
It was the only points of access to the water.
Yeah.
So it was, imagine an underpass under a highway, for example, or if you're familiar, let's say Tenian Beach, the only underpass to the water, it's the same moment, it's the same point where the water enters.
Yeah, so does that indicate that that's currently public access, publicly owned? Is that why people
Yes.
are able to go down there? So there's an opportunity to not get tied up in the type of stuff that, I was gonna ask Dahlia what the time frame of going through all those bureaucracies and political stuff that she has to go through. But if that's like a low-hanging fruit, I don't know.
I would say that it's public, but it's state, and the plan is by the city. So
that's confusing.
Yes, it should be much easier than negotiating with individual private owners to coordinate a flood protection or an adaptation system, but it still has its regulatory challenges.
Interesting. That map that you showed of that area, where you showed a lot of infrastructure there, I'm going to be taking advantage of that in Tyler's course. Just a heads up, Tyler. That's great. I'm looking at that like that's a little gift to me. So, of information. There's some good opportunity there.
Just to respond about the timeline, it's a good question. I think usually when we look at these implementation pathways, we're looking at 15 to 10 years. So yeah, for the extremely complex projects like in Boston, well, right now with specifically the Island and Park, we have an opportunity to move forward relatively fast. Well, at least at the part that's owned by the city. So we're designing it with Weston and Sampson right now and building the community engagement process. However, the question will be to find funding for it because it will be a very expensive endeavor. And that might take several years, especially now after COVID and having Chelsea been one of the kind of hardest hit in the area.
That's why I was asking Dave about that insurance stuff, whether it's also commercial and whether there's an incentive to get buy-in, you know, like lowering the insurance rates if they kick in or something. But a 10 or 15-year time frame, by the time you get everybody on board, there'll be no people to persuade.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what happens in sort of real estate development sometimes. That's the challenge.
Love the discussion about time because it is 7:31. But I was just gonna maybe say I'm happy that we're touching on time because that's a big issue. You know, we're designing infrastructure to last how many years? Some bridges last 100 years. Do they need to if coastlines are shifting in 25? And if you dial the clock back 400 years in Boston, it's a landscape that we couldn't recognize. So, you know, Tyler, if you're moving to Boston 2220, it may be a blip that we stopped for about 50 years, cleaned up the Boston Harbor. Now it's a place that people actually want to be again. They're not. It's no longer a trash heap. And then after that, what happened? You know, so the scale of time is very interesting. Infrastructure is super expensive, but when you're facing $1 trillion worth of damage, is it really? So that scale issue is really fascinating to me.
Yeah,
But I
and
can go on and on.
John
Right,
actually commented on Dave's favorite topic about whether it's reasonable to abandon areas that are high risk of flooding, and whether we retreat versus trying to protect the coastline that is extremely vulnerable. But I feel like that could be another session altogether.
Yes, definitely. Future topics. We've got a few future topics here. I think that we can explore. Maybe we put out some kind of a poll and ask people to, you know, vote on what topics they'd like to hear. Because oftentimes it's Devanshi and I brainstorming on cool people we want to bring in, which we've done. Devanshi, great idea to do the rapid fire event, and we definitely got some fantastic people. I want to be respectful of people's dinner times now that it's getting light earlier and earlier. Don't know what it's like in you folks in Europe, but if there are no other burning questions, maybe we should wrap up and thank our panelists. This was fantastic. We'd love to get you folks back for deeper discussions. You are on the hook to update us when the plans get released. Climate Ready Dorchester, the work on the East Island River, the Chelsea and Everett work, and then Tyler, you know, get us to come to your do guest crits now that you can have billions of people come via Zoom. It's much easier.
Definitely.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks so much.
Great conversation.
Thanks everybody for joining. We appreciate it, and stay tuned for future BSA core events.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good
night,
evening.
everybody.
Bye.
Okay.